All right. Hello, and welcome to week 3 of the Revenge Capitalism seminar. Thank you for joining us again. We are joined, as we are all weeks, by a number of seminar participants who are waiting for our follow-up discussion to this lecture portion of the seminar, and by many of you online who are either watching live with us or will tune in later via our YouTube channel. Thank you for taking the time. My name is Max Haiven, and I am Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University. And along with Cassie Thornton, who is facilitating this seminar, I co-direct the Reimagining Value Action Lab at Lakehead University, which is a workshop for the radical imagination, social justice, and decolonization. This seminar is being held and sponsored by our lab rival and Pluto Press, who are the publishers of Revenge Capitalism, which will be launched to the public on May 20th, just a couple of weeks away now. And also by Roar Magazine. So please check them out. I know that right now Pluto Press has a sale on a number of books in and around May Day, so please do head over to their website and check it out. Today, we are looking at a number of chapters from this book, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghosts of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts. And just to give you a sense of where we are in the whole scheme of things, this is our third week of the seminar, and we're looking at a number of chapters in the latter half of the book. So the book is structured around 5 main chapters, and as well as an introduction and conclusion. And then also short interludes that stand between the chapters as ways of considering cultural texts. So today we're going to begin with a discussion of an interlude called Khloe Kardashian's Revenge Body, or the Zapatista Nobody. Then we're going to look at the 4th chapter from the book, Our Opium Wars, Pain, Race, and the Ghosts of Empire. And then we're going to look at the final interlude in the book, V's Vendetta, or Joker's Retribution. And if we have time, we'll come to the postscript, which I wrote just a few weeks ago as we were entering into the lockdown phase of the current pandemic, titled After the Pandemic, Against the Vindictive Normal. But we'll see how far we get. So this week I want to try and keep my lecture short because we have a full schedule of presenters in the seminar portion. And if you want to find out more about the book in general, you can go to the previous 2 lectures on YouTube and learn about it there, or head over to my website at maxhaiven.com. The last name is spelled H-A-I-V-E-N, maxhaiven.com/revenge capitalism, and you can actually read chapter summaries there and find other videos and audio, and there you go. All right, so let's jump in and start talking about Khloe Kardashian's Revenge Body. Many of you might have seen Revenge Body. On the right, you can see a casting call for the show for reality TV participants in this show. It is still airing, as far as I know. It's still on television, and the premise is very simple. In it, a contestant who obviously, as the casting call implies, applies to be on the show, declares that they want to get some form of revenge, usually on a former lover or a sort of an estranged member of their family, for jilting them, for dismissing them, for belittling them, for abusing them. And they do so through a regimen of sort of bodybuilding, usually aimed at weight loss. And I wanted to take up this example, partly because it's one of the only shows on television currently that is actually explicitly about revenge and features revenge on its in its title, but also because I think it allows us to enter into some of the questions about gender and revenge, which have been quite central to the development of my ideas in this book about how we can think about revenge and revenge politics and revenge capitalism in the age in which we find ourselves. And so I have a couple of quotations here from the book, which I thought I would read and then expand on a little for the purposes of this lecture. The notion of a revenge body makes a kind of intuitive sense within a society that persistently frames social media problems, this is a great Freudian slip, that persistently frames social problems as individual burdens and which blames individuals for what are actually systemically and structurally compounded misfortunes. A society in which the punitive demands to conform to patriarchal beauty norms, for instance, are not framed as a source of oppression, but as an invitation to individualistic empowerment. It is a vindictive system, in a sense, that in turn provides its own catalysts for a kind of non-transformative revenge that by and large ends up reproducing the status quo. So as those of you who have followed this seminar before know, or who have read parts of the book know, a major theme that I'm trying to grapple with in Revenge Capitalism is the way that a system itself can take revenge. Not individuals within that system, but a system itself, though it may have no human intelligence or human emotions, there's a way in which capitalism breeds within it a kind of vengefulness against humanity, against the rest of the world, against non-human animals and non-human actors of all sorts. And so I try and extend this in this chapter on Revenge Body to think about the kind of revenge that is being taken on us by this system. And then also the way in which the system offers us fantasies of revenge that are non-transformative, which is to say, it offers us fantasies of revenge that actually, rather than do anything to undermine or transform the system at all, reproduce the system. And I think Revenge Body with Khloe Kardashian is an excellent example of this, right? The entire idea of a revenge body, that you would lose weight, that you would try and conform to the norm as a means to get revenge on somebody, while in a certain sense has a certain intuitive sense to it, also makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I go on to write in this chapter that the show Revenge Body instills the contestant with a kind of neoliberal political economic aesthetic. The contestant is taught that the slings and arrows of the world can be met through an investment in themselves, a process of sometimes grueling personal bodily transformation. And indeed, the pain of that transformation is a kind of evidence of their success. Revenge, then, in this show is first and foremost a revenge against the self, a self-punishment aimed not at abolishing the source of the injury, but transcend, if not becoming it. And I ask, what, by contrast, would a reality TV show called Avenging Body look like? By which I mean a show that, rather than fixating on a form of revenge within the moral economy of oppression that caused the injury in the first place, that instead dreamed of a form of collective vindication that abolished the source of injury. So in this book, I, at many moments, try and contrast, on the one hand, a kind of logic or system of revenge, which sometimes can be vindicating personally in the sense that you take revenge on someone or something that harmed you, but that ultimately is not transformative. And I contrast that to what I call avenging, which I see as an impulse not simply to take revenge on an individual, or not simply to get a kind of poetic justice, although that may be part of it, but also to try and abolish the system that hurt you so that nobody has to be hurt in the same way. It's not simply an attempt to turn the tables, but to overturn the tables. It's not an attempt to balance the scales, but to destroy the scales, which is to say that the system itself is fundamentally broken. In Revenge Body, a lot is made of the contestant's bodily weight of fat as a kind of pathology that needs the contestant needs to work on, that they need to feel ashamed of, and that they need to destroy, and they need to destroy this part of themselves in order to be able to take revenge, for instance, on a lover who may have at one point jilted them. But of course, the irony of the show is that the contestant is seeking to conform to the norms of patriarchal, Western, Eurocentric, colonial beauty standards, which prize thinness and athleticism of a certain sort, precisely because it was their lack of those, or apparent or alleged lack of those qualities, that led them to, for instance, be dumped in the first place. So though the show encourages us to imagine that weight loss and athleticism is a form of revenge on the lover who jilted, in fact, in a strange way, it simply reproduces the exact same patriarchal norms and cycles that started the problem in the first place. So what would an avenging body look like? Something that's separate from this idea of the revenge body, which simply reproduces the system that started in the first place. Well, here I turn to a very interesting text by a group called the Colombo Women's Delegation from Northern Carolina, who traveled a few years ago to a gathering called by the women of the Zapatista Army for National Liberation in Chiapas, Mexico. This is an indigenous insurgent movement which rose up in armed resistance decades ago to reclaim a large area of the Mexican highlands, and has since that time been running a kind of autonomous grassroots form of direct democracy. This gathering, which was for feminists from around the world to come together for convergence. And the Colombo Women's Delegation sent their delegation, as you would imagine from the name. And that delegation came away very impressed and inspired by the Zapatista example and the example expressed by women in the Zapatista community, but also very disheartened because many of the contributions brought by women from North America and from Northern Europe tended to focus a great deal on the liberation of the individual body through embodied radical practices, which might include creative movement, it might include DIY health practices. They might include yoga and meditation. And the Colombo Women's Delegation wrote a response, which was published in Viewpoint magazine, which I think is very important for us to read at this moment. But I'm just going to share a bit of it, which is quoted in the chapter with you. So the Colombo Women's Delegation writes, "In the current system, we are offered only weak substitutes for a deep and authentic sense of self. We have been sold many forms of freeing ourselves from oppressive conditions that necessarily pass through the process of becoming somebody, of achieving recognition or a place in the limelight. We think that the Zapatistas are showing us a process of becoming altogether nobody, of creating a largely invisible and mostly anonymous social power from below with a far more profound response to exploitation, dispossession, repression, and humiliation than the symbolic and select somebodies permitted by capitalist structures. The only body that can free us is the social body, constituted by those anonymous acts of collective self-organization capable of birthing a new way of life." I can't recommend this essay strongly enough. Again, you can find it at Viewpoint magazine from the Colombo Women's Delegation. And I think what's so important about it is that it is a perfect contrast to the kind of somebody creation of reality TV emblematized by the show Revenge Body with Khloe Kardashian. Kardashian herself is precisely the kind of somebody who gets created purely by capitalism, right? This is a person with practically no talents and no reason for being a celebrity, if indeed one ever needed a reason to be a celebrity. It's a person who's been elevated to a status of a multimillionaire and an influential person simply by the sort of magic machinations of capital. So compared to this vacuous somebody, we have this rich nobody, this dense form of nobody, which the Colombo Women's Delegation is proposing, made up of forms of collective self-organization towards building a different and better world. All right. We continue with a kind of focus on the body and a focus on health with the next chapter, which is titled Our Opium Wars, Pain, and the term pain is struck out and under erasure, as we say, Pain, Race, and the Ghosts of Empire. And here I take up the ongoing opioid nightmare that has been unleashed not only on the United States, but especially on the United States in the last decade and a half, in which the Sackler family, which is a very exclusive family of multimillionaires, and their corporation Purdue Pharma has borne a lot of the blame for the incredible rise in prescription opioids across the United States over the last 20 years or so. And I'll show you some statistics about this in a moment. What you see here before you is a demonstration led, at least in the press, by Nan Goldin, the well-known contemporary photographer, who quite courageously a couple of years ago broke the story of the fact that she had become addicted to prescription painkillers that had been pushed by the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, and other pharmaceutical companies, and had struggled with addiction for a number of years before finally shaking the habit. She and other demonstrators, many of whom are activists with ACT UP and other sort of organizations that have been protesting around unequal access to health over the last decades, staged a demonstration here. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, at the Temple of Dendur, which was an ancient Egyptian temple that was transplanted to New York in the 1960s. The area that it was situated was actually flooded by the building of the Nasser Dam. This demonstration was to draw attention to the fact that this wing of the Met was constructed with the money of the three original Sackler brothers who founded Purdue Pharma and who collectively bear the responsibility, and their descendants bear the profits of the incredible use of opium, prescription opioids essentially, which are much more powerful than opium, to make an incredible fortune. The opioid in this case is OxyContin, but it's only one of many prescription opioids that were created over the same period of time. In this chapter, I draw some parallels between the scourge of prescription opioids, which are today really rotting out the heart of many areas in the United States, with the ways in which addiction destroys the social and economic fabric, to the way in which the original scourge of opium in China destroyed that country's society in the 19th century. And as in the case of the 20th century and 21st century corporate drug pushers, we also had a kind of prelude to this in the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, when the British, as well as the French and Americans, but mostly the British, forced to the Chinese empire to open its ports to the importation of opium at the point of a literal and figurative bayonet. This opium was grown for the British Empire by the East India Company in mostly in what is now Bengal, under incredibly totalitarian conditions that were incredibly destructive to Indian people, then exported to China, where it flooded into the Chinese market, causing incredible devastation across the landscape. This importation of opium was justified by the British as not only commercially successful, and of course they justify it by saying, well, if we, the British, didn't do this, then another European empire would, and therefore we should be allowed to. It was also justified in the name of free trade. And as John Bowring put it, one of the governors of Hong Kong at the time, which was set up essentially as a drug smuggling port by the British, free trade is Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ is free trade. In other words, the British had not only a right but a duty to force the Chinese to import opium as a means of civilizing them. This was the British idea at the time. Now, it should be mentioned that within Britain itself, there was a great resistance to this among the working classes, among organized socialists, and even among liberals and others within the English Parliament. But their voices were drowned out by the incredible wealth that flowed into England throughout the 19th century from the opium trade. Not only wealth, but also thousands and thousands of priceless Chinese antiquities, which flowed out of China to pay for the opium, along with tea and porcelain and other precious commodities. Many of those artifacts now find themselves in collections of Chinese antiquities in Western museums, and many of those museums, including the Victoria and Albert, the Met, as we've already mentioned, the Harvard museums, the museums at Princeton and Yale, all bear the name of the Sackler family. The Sacklers were eager collectors of Asian antiquities as well. Now, the theft and the movement of antiquities is one crime, but the greater crime perhaps is what prescription opioids did to the United States over the last few years. And we are coming to where this connects to revenge in a moment, although perhaps you can already sense where this is going. I want to quote here from a report from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. Doctors wrote 72.4 opioid prescriptions per 100 persons in 2006. 72 prescriptions per 100 persons in the entire United States. This rate increased 4.1% annually from 2006 to 2008 and 1.1 annually from 2008 to 2012, before decreasing 5% annually from 2012 to 2016. reaching a rate of 66.5 per 100 persons in 2016. In that year, almost 20%, 19.1 per 100 persons received one or more opioid prescription, with an average patient receiving 3.5 prescriptions. This is a staggering number of people who are prescribed drugs that are, by all accounts, much more powerful than street heroin, certainly much more powerful than the opium which ravaged the Chinese economy and society in the 19th century. And I want to take this as an invitation for us to think through the deep connections between empire, race, capitalism, and racism now. As you'll see from the map above, this is a map of what gets called by demographers deaths of despair, which have disproportionately been attributed to white people in the so-called American heartland, in the Rust Belt, in Appalachia, and in other poor rural and suburban and exurban neighborhoods. Much has been made of these deaths of despair, and much has been made of the way in which those people and those areas that have suffered higher rates of deaths of despair over the opioid epidemic have tended to have increasingly reactionary voting patterns. So the chapter focuses on a particular statistic, which suggests that one of the best predictors of the swing of voters from voting for Obama in 2012 to Trump in 2016 was the number of deaths from despair that happened in that district. Now, this has led a number of commentators to suggest that we have been remiss in ignoring the plight of white working class and rural people. And to a certain extent, there is some merit to that argument, but it gets very, very dangerous because it plays into the hands of a right-wing rhetoric that suggests that quote unquote special interest groups, by which they mean non-white people and advocates and activists associated with racial justice, have somehow deprived white, poor, and working class people of the attention and care that is due to them. In fact, that is a very poor analysis of what's happening, because if we look deeper, there's a long history that connects racism, drugs, and capitalism in the United States. We can begin by noting that a number of the richest Boston families that still today hold a great deal of influence, or whose money has gone into building the United States, got extremely rich in the Opium Wars. We can also point out that the Opium Wars in China led to a mass diaspora of Chinese people who were forced to flee the country because of the economic breakdown that were caused. And many of those Chinese people ended up in North America, in the United States in particular, as highly exploitable, often indebted laborers who, for instance, were central and pivotal to the building of railroads that allowed for the United States to be colonized. We also need to think about the way in which throughout American history, drugs and fear of drugs have been used as a way to mobilize and to organize white supremacy. So we can see this, for instance, during the Opium Wars in the 19th century, when anti-Chinese racism was mobilized around the fear that Chinese people were bringing opium into the United States and using it to enslave or undermine white workers and enslave, especially sexually enslave, white women, with, of course, absolutely no evidence to suggest that this was, of course, true. It was simply a racist mythology used by politicians and by capitalist actors to unify white people around a sense of racial persecution that then could create alliances across class divisions. We've seen more recently the same kind of castigation, especially by Donald Trump, of Latin American people, specifically Mexicans, who are accused of bringing drugs across the border. So drugs are framed as an alien threat tied to racialized people, as a way to unify a white supremacist worldview that attaches itself to the idea of the innocence of America and innocence of whiteness and white people. This is an extremely potent, an extremely narcotic, and an extremely dangerous mythology, but one that continues to have such suasion over so many people, especially as people's lives get harder and harder and harder, no matter what racial group that they come from. Though I should, of course, mention that though life is getting indeed harder for many, many white people, it still remains the case that almost all forms of economic and social pain and deprivation disproportionately affect non-white people in the United States. So this leads me to suggest that from one angle at least, the Trump phenomenon and the revenge politics that it represents, which I talk about in the first chapter of this book, is the rage-filled conductive scream of a society in pain. But from another angle, it is the dope-sick panic of whiteness itself, that great anesthetic, which, as a psychosocial sociological formation, was always used to dull the senses to the pain of others. Like all addictions, whiteness's effectiveness constantly diminishes with use, demanding an ever higher dose. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the latest developments in critical race theory, I highly suggest that you look into them. It's a fascinating field and it has a lot to explain to us in this moment. But the first and foremost thing to remember is that race as a way of categorizing human beings is something that was created. There is no such thing as biological races. That is a fiction that was created largely in the 19th century and largely as a way of creating humans into a hierarchy that could justify European domination of the globe. So there is no such thing as the white race. There is no such thing as white or non-white in a biological sense. We have known from geneticists that there's in fact greater genetic diversity within so-called racial groups than there is between racial groups. You can look this up if you're interested. When we speak about whiteness, we're not speaking about fundamental characteristics of all people who have white skin. Who gets considered white changes over time. So some people who are today considered white would not 100 or 200 years ago have been considered white. For instance, many people from Eastern Europe, Irish people, for instance, who tend to have extremely fair skin would not have been considered white even 100 or 150 years ago. So whiteness is a constructed category. It doesn't refer to particular people, but certain people have access to whiteness. Certain people are read by society as white, and certain people consider themselves white. And so when I speak about whiteness in this phrase and in this chapter, I'm thinking about those who have access to the social construction and what that social construction does for those of us who consider ourselves white, or who are considered by society as white. And I suggest here that we can use the notion of the anesthetic as a good metaphor for what whiteness does, because it dulls the senses. Anesthesis, from its Greek root, is the dulling of the senses. The aesthesis, the aesthetic, the senses. Anesthetic dulls the senses. And so I try and suggest that whiteness in a certain way dulls our senses to the pain and suffering of others in the way that it elevates whiteness to the top of the racial hierarchy and denigrates all non-white people to explain them as unthinking and unfeeling. This gains credence, especially when we consider that the reason why white people have been disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic. And we should mention here that many people from many different ethnic groups have been horrifically affected by this epidemic. But one of the reasons why the epidemic has hit white populations, or has been perceived to hit white populations so hard, is because many other racialized populations were denied prescription opioids at the doctor's office. So there is ample evidence to suggest that Black people who visited the doctor complaining of pain were prescribed opioids at a far lower rate than white people presenting almost exactly the same symptoms or levels of pain, because of the inherent and unquestioned bias and racist assumptions of doctors, which, based on centuries of racist ideology, believed that Black people could not be trusted to attest to their own measurement of pain, and that Black people could sustain greater levels of pain. So we know this from the epidemiological evidence. So when we look at something like the opioid epidemic, we need to complicate our understandings of race and racism to understand that these are forms of systemic and structural, as well as interpersonal and ideological bias. I want to link this in my discussion then to, of course, previous moments when social pain has manifested into political evil, for lack of a better term. And here, of course, I return to the rise of fascism and Nazism in Germany, And I return, of course, to the work of a scholar who has been extremely influential in this entire book, the German communist philosopher Walter Benjamin. And here I draw on the interpretation of Walter Benjamin's work. Benjamin wrote in the 1930s and tragically committed suicide while fleeing the Nazis at the French-Spanish border in the late 1930s. And here I draw on the work of a great Benjamin interpreter of our current age, Susan Buck Morris. My screen right now is just hiding from me this quote, so let me read it to you now. Okay, the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century was defined not only by new aesthetics in the field of mechanically reproduced culture, so this might include the phonograph, film reels, cartoons, mass-produced culture that was totally new in the 19th century. Industrial capitalism was also marked by the proliferation of pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical anesthetics, that is to say, methods by which proletarians, the working class, could dull their torqued, sensing bodies to survive the accelerating mediatic and haptic violences of capitalism. These included the use of narcotics, but also the narcotizing qualities of mass culture itself, cheap sentimentality, Manichean narrative closure, Manichean meaning black and white, good and evil, bombastic aesthetics, reckless melodrama, and the like. Now, fascism, while doing nothing to alleviate the pain and sensory overload of the proletariat, of the working class, gives thrilling expression to their suffering, often in the very same media as the mass media are presenting commercial work. The hyperbolic participatory spectacles which overwhelm the censors and the maximalist effectively consuming pageantry of fascism represented for Walter Benjamin the aestheticization of politics, not just the transformation of politics into hyper-nationalist spectacles, as we see on the right, but a politics calibrated to exploit the fractured, wounded, and rewired sensorium of the industrialized, self-anesthetizing proletarian body. Benjamin argued that such a body, and such a body politic, comes to delight in the spectacle of its own annihilation, eagerly careening towards a self-destructive orgy of violence, the immolation of the individual in the forge of the vengeful mass. So just to recap this very briefly, the argument of Benjamin is that through the 19th century, as people got shoved into dense slums in cities in Europe, in Berlin and London and elsewhere, as workers were subjected to the kind of abuse of their body and their senses by factories, by urban life, there was a kind of desperate need of the working class to escape, at least for a moment, the conditions of their exploitation and misery through the use of anesthetics. So this might include drugs and alcohol, but it might also include the kind of mass-produced culture that was being offered to working class people as a kind of balm for their wounded selves, their wounded bodies, and their wounded sensorium. And that fascism and its narcotic, its anesthetizing property, functions because it gives a kind of expression to the pain of the body that endures capitalism, while of course doing nothing to transform or change those underlying conditions. In fact, those conditions get worse under fascism. The imperative to work, to consume increasingly anesthetizing fascist mass culture gets harder and more difficult and more intense. But yet fascism is a kind of political ideology, a modern political ideology calibrated to take advantage of what becomes of the human animal in a moment where we are under constant sensory barrage. And I try and use this as well as incredible forms of exploitation. And I try and use this as a way of thinking through the kind of neo-fascist turn of our moment and the resurgence of revenge politics that is the subject of this book. Now, the final section that we're going to talk about today, and I'll speak about it very quickly, is a comparison between V for Vendetta and Joker. Two films that I think were both huge blockbuster hits, very popular, and that also in a strange way seemed on the one hand take from social movement activities and give back to social movement activities in terms of a visual repertoire. So as I write here, both V for Vendetta and Joker are means by which Hollywood, for all its contradictions as a capitalist industry, both processes and co-opts social movement symbolism, but at the same time provides semiotic and narrative resources for popular mobilization. So on the right, on the top right-hand corner here, you can see the famous scene from the end of the film V for Vendetta, where the avenging hero has sent out masks and capes and hats to all of the citizens of a fascist Britain in a dystopian future. And they wear these masks in order to storm the parliament buildings, demanding a sort of revolution. And the final scene of the film, at least, they remove their masks and hats as the military refuses to fire on them in a sort of successful revolutionary moment. This film, which came out in the early 2000s, became, the symbolism of it became very, very profound around the time of Occupy Wall Street. And in fact, the Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta became a key sort of sigil of the protest movements around the world. And here it is at the bottom, just last year in Hong Kong, used as a way in which Hong Kong protesters could hide their face from the increasingly punitive form of surveillance capitalism of the Chinese state apparatus. On the left, we have, on the top left-hand corner, one of the final scenes in Joker, last year's blockbuster hit with Joaquin Phoenix, about the Batman villain, the sort of backstory of the Batman villain, in which he becomes the leader of a kind of anarchic riot. And down on the bottom left, we have a protester in Chile in last year's anti-austerity and anti-neoliberalism protest, who's kind of explicitly taken on the aesthetics and costuming of Joker in order to be able to participate in street demonstrations. So in this interlude, I meditate first and foremost on the way in which Hollywood takes symbolism from social movements, but also gives symbolism back to social movements. And I try and consider what this would mean within a very particular light, and that is the light of gender roles and patriarchy. So I analyze both V for Vendetta and Joker as highly patriarchal narratives. In V for Vendetta, we have a sort of anarchic conquering hero who single-handedly, through his own brilliance and fortitude, is able to dominate and sort of undermine an entire fascist system, giving us again a rehearsal of a certain notion of masculine agency that is, while in this case it offers a subversive flavor, is in fact entirely in keeping with the long history of patriarchal narratives about male agency and the possibility and the uses of male violence as a form of political change. Similarly, in Joker, we do have a film that, on the one hand, very importantly, sheds light on the connection between austerity, neoliberalism, and mental illness in society, and the forms of revenge politics it can breed. And yet at the same time, we have a film that once again glamorizes, or at least sympathizes with, a kind of violent, virulent, revanchist masculinity. And in Joker in particular, it's important to recognize that this form of masculinity takes as its targets and finds as its blameworthy victims mostly women of color. So if you watch this film again, I'd encourage you to watch very closely for how race and gender fit together in this otherwise quite sympathetic tale of a white, poor man and his trials and tribulations in a neoliberal society. That's it for our lecture today, because we want to get to our seminar. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week for the final part of the seminar, where we look at the last parts of this book. And please follow up, if you like, at maxhaiven.com/revengecapitalism. And if you check out that website, you'll also see that we have a number of events coming up concerning the launch of the book later this month, including this one on May 7th.